The road to Blackstone Ranch was not the kind of road that forgave mistakes. It cut through the Wyoming flatlands like an afterthought, two shallow ruts pressed into the earth by wagon wheels, half buried under the last of the spring snow that hadn't fully given up yet. The wind came sideways off the ridge, carrying grit and cold and the faint smell of pine resin from somewhere too far away to matter. Mabel Hart kept her head down against it, her wool coat buttoned to the throat, her hands working the reins of an old bay mare that had seen better decades. She was 23 years old. She was not small. She had known since childhood that the world would not let her forget either of those facts. The mare's name was Biscuit, which was the name Mabel had given her 7 years ago when the horse was young, and Mabel was 16 and didn't yet understand how much a name like that would follow you. People had started calling Mabel that too, eventually. Not to her face, not most of them, but she'd heard it enough times that the word had lost its sting somewhere along the way and become just another thing she carried. She had a canvas pack strapped behind her saddle. Inside it, 3 changes of clothes, a small tin of her mother's dried herbs, a well-used copy of a cooking reference she'd nearly memorized, and a jar of blackberry preserves she'd put up herself the previous autumn. The preserves were not strictly necessary. She'd brought them anyway. Her mother's voice was still in her ears from that morning. "You don't have to do this, Mabel." "I know. They're not going to be kind to you." "They don't have to be kind. They just have to eat." Ruth Hart had laughed at that, though it had ended in a cough that bent her double. The cough was the whole reason Mabel was on this road at all. Ruth had cooked for Blackstone Ranch for 11 years, had ridden out there every Monday and Friday through weather that would have turned back a sensible person, had fed 20 men through 3 hard winters and a drought and a fire that took the East Barn in 1874. She was good at it. She was respected for it. And now her lungs were making sounds that no amount of willow bark or rest seemed to fix. And the ride to Blackstone was something her body could no longer manage. Mabel had written to the ranch 4 days ago. She'd explained the situation plainly, without decoration. Her mother was ill. She had been helping Ruth cook since she was old enough to reach the stove. She knew every dish Ruth had made for the ranch. She was available immediately and willing to discuss wages. She had not mentioned her size. She figured they would discover that on their own soon enough, and there was no point giving anyone a head start on their opinions. She had not received a written reply. What she'd gotten instead was a verbal message, delivered by the feed store owner in town who happened to do business with Blackstone. The ranch owner would speak with her when she arrived, but he made no promises. She had taken that as a yes. The main house came into view around mid-morning, rising out of a shallow depression in the land like something that had been put there through stubbornness rather than planning. It was a 2-story structure of weathered pine and stone, solid-looking but grim, with a long porch that ran the width of the front and a yard that showed the particular kind of disorder that came from too many working men and not enough time. There were 3 outbuildings she could see, a long bunkhouse off to the left, a large barn beyond it, and what looked like a smokehouse further back. Several horses were penned in a corral near the barn. A dog of indeterminate breed lifted its head from the porch steps to look at her, decided she wasn't interesting, and put its head back down. 3 men were working near the corral fence, replacing a section of rail. They stopped when Mabel rode in. She felt their eyes before she'd fully dismounted. She tied Biscuit to the post near the trough, patted the mare's neck once, and turned to face the yard with the same expression she'd practiced her whole life. Not aggressive, not apologetic, just present, just here. One of the men at the fence said something to the others. She didn't hear the words, but she heard the laughter that came after, low and quick, the kind men produce when they think they're being subtle and aren't. She walked toward the porch. "You the Hart woman?" The man who spoke was leaning against the far post, arms folded. He was maybe 40, with a sun-damaged face and a mustache that needed attention. He had the look of someone who ran things when the owner wasn't watching. "Mabel Hart," she said. "I'm here to see Mr. Blackstone." He looked her over the way a person looks at livestock they're considering buying and have already decided against. "He's in the office. I'll tell him you're here." He didn't move immediately. "You do know this is a working ranch, not light work." "I know what a ranch is." "Kitchen work here, it's not just cooking. It's hauling water, keeping the wood box full, cleaning up after 20 men who weren't raised to be careful about it." "I've been doing that kind of work since I was 12, Mabel said. "I'll manage." He looked at her for another moment, then pushed off the post and went inside. Mabel stood on the porch and looked out at the yard and did not allow herself to feel anything in particular about the way the men at the fence were still watching her. Gideon Blackstone was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she'd expected. He was younger than she'd imagined, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been set in place and never quite relaxed since. His office was a small room off the main hallway, crowded with ledgers and maps and a smell of old coffee and wood smoke. He was standing behind the desk when the foreman, who'd introduced himself as Harlan Cole, brought her in. He didn't extend his hand. Miss Hart. He looked at her, just looked, for a moment, in that flat and assessing way that some people thought constituted thinking. Your mother's been with us since before I took over the ranch. She's a good cook. Yes, she is. You've worked with her? My whole life, essentially. She taught me everything she knows. I've been covering most of the cooking at home for the past 2 years while her health's been declining. That's domestic cooking, Harlan said from behind her. Cooking for a ranch crew is different. It's larger quantities, Mabel said, not turning around. The principles are the same. Gideon's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted, some small thing. He looked down at the desk, moved a paper without purpose, looked back up. I'll be honest with you. I need someone who can start immediately. I've had 2 weeks of Harlan trying to manage the meals, and the situation is becoming... He paused. The men are unhappy. I can start today. It's a long commitment. I'm not looking for someone who will last a week and decide the work's too hard. Mr. Blackstone, Mabel said, keeping her voice level. I rode 2.5 hours this morning to be here. I didn't come for a week's work. He looked at her again. She had the sense that he was used to people looking away first, and that it mildly surprised him when she didn't. Room and board, he said. Same wages your mother received. Trial period of 30 days. After that, we'll discuss terms again. That's acceptable. Harlan will show you the kitchen. The men eat at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. Breakfast and supper in the house, midday brought out to wherever they're working. He sat down, which seemed to be his version of ending the conversation. Don't make promises you can't keep. I won't, she said. She meant it as an answer and also as something else, though she kept that part to herself. The kitchen was a disaster, not dramatically, not broken windows or collapsed shelving. It was the slower kind of disaster, the kind that accumulates when nobody with any real sense of order has been managing a space. The dry goods were poorly organized, some of them nearly empty, some of them duplicated in odd quantities. The wood box was down to its last few pieces. The coffee pot had a film of old residue that suggested it had not been properly cleaned in longer than she wanted to think about. There was a pot of something on the back of the stove that had been sitting long enough to qualify as a scientific specimen. Mabel stood in the middle of it for about 30 seconds. Then she put down her pack, rolled up her sleeves, and started with the stove. She worked through the afternoon without stopping except to go out to the woodpile and carry in enough fuel to get through the evening. When one of the younger ranch hands, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, appeared in the doorway and stared at her, she didn't look up from the pot she was scrubbing. Can I help you with something? She asked. Harlan said there was a new cook. That's right. A pause. You need help with the wood? She did. Her arms were already aching and the wood box was still only half full, but she looked up at the boy who had an open, uncertain face and appeared to be trying to figure out whether this offer would get him in trouble with the other men or not. And she said, That'd be useful. Thank you. His name was Pete. He was 17, from Ohio, had been at Blackstone Ranch for 8 months, and by the time he'd made 3 trips to the woodpile, he'd told her all of this without her asking anything beyond his name. She let him talk while she worked. People who could talk without needing much in return were useful to have nearby. The other guys are saying some things, Pete said, on the 3rd trip, setting wood into the box with more care than the task strictly required. About you. I'm not saying I agree with it. I expect they are, Mabel said. It's not right. No, she agreed. It isn't. She didn't offer any more than that because there wasn't anything useful to add. The talking would happen, or it wouldn't. The only currency she actually had was the food, and the food wasn't ready yet. At 6 o'clock, the men came in from the day's work, and found the table set and the kitchen warm, and a smell in the air that several of them would later struggle to describe precisely. Something with beef and onion and herbs, something that reminded one man of his grandmother's house in Tennessee, and another of a winter Sunday he couldn't quite locate in his memory, but knew had been good. There was a beef stew that Mabel had built from the available provisions, rich and dark and properly seasoned, with biscuits she'd made in the last hour. Not elaborate biscuits, but solid ones, the kind that held up when you used them to clean the bowl. There was a pot of beans that had been cooked down until they were creamy, and a pan of fried apple slices she'd made from a half bushel she'd found in the cold storage outside, which no one had apparently thought to use. The men sat down and were quiet, in the way that men get quiet when something exceeds their expectations, and they haven't yet decided how to handle that. Harlan Cole ate his first bowl without speaking, ate half of a second. Then he put his spoon down and said, to no one in particular, "Not bad." It was not a compliment exactly. It was more like a verdict. Mabel, who was cleaning the stove and had her back to the room, allowed herself a small exhale. Just that. Nothing else. Gideon Blackstone came in late, after the other men had mostly finished. He sat at the head of the table and Mabel brought him a bowl and a plate of biscuits without being asked, then went back to the stove. She heard him eat. She didn't watch. When she came to clear his place, he had cleaned the bowl. He said nothing, but he had cleaned the bowl. The first week was the hardest. Not because of the work. The work was familiar, just larger in scale, but the eyes were constant. She felt them in the morning when she crossed the yard to get water. She heard what passed between the men when they thought she was out of earshot, some of it rough, some of it just the kind of thoughtless talk that men produce about women they've categorized as objects of ridicule rather than people. The word biscuit surfaced twice that she knew of. Maybe more times she didn't. She kept working. She got up at 4:30 every morning before the light and started the stoves and had coffee ready by 5 and breakfast. Always something hot, always something that filled, on the table at 6. She managed the inventory with the careful attention of someone who knew how quickly scarcity arrived on the frontier. She found, on her second day, that the cold storage had a drainage problem that was allowing moisture to get into the root vegetables, and she rerouted the drainage herself with a flat stone and some packed earth, which was inelegant but functional. She mended a curtain in the main room that had been hanging torn for what looked like months. She swept the porch. She didn't do these things to be noticed. She did them because they needed doing, and she was there. On the 5th day, a man named Cutter, broad-shouldered, not young, the kind of quiet that came from disposition rather than shyness, came into the kitchen in the afternoon and stood in the doorway for a moment before saying, "Mrs. Hart's bean recipe, you using that?" "Yes, adjusted for quantity." He nodded. "That's good. Hers was the best thing on the menu." He turned to go. "I added smoked paprika," Mabel said. "If you noticed a difference." He paused. "I noticed. A beat. It was better?" He left before she could respond, which was fine. She stood there with a wooden spoon and felt something modest and solid settle in her chest. Not triumph, just traction, just the sense of earth under her feet. Monked. The second week she made bread. Not the quick kind. Real bread, yeast bread, started 2 days in advance with a starter she'd been cultivating since arriving. The bread came out of the oven on a Thursday morning with a crust that cracked the right way and a crumb that was open and tender, and the smell of it moved through the whole house with an authority that she had been counting on. Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway within 10 minutes, drawn by the smell. Then 2 other younger hands. Then Cutter. Harlan came in last, poured himself coffee, and stood looking at the loaves cooling on the rack with an expression that clearly wanted to remain neutral and wasn't fully succeeding. "You're not supposed to be making bread," he said. "Too time-consuming." "I've been managing my time," Mabel said. "The other supplies are handled. Check the inventory book. I updated it yesterday." He checked it. He didn't say anything else about the bread. That evening, at supper, she sliced the loaves and put them on the table, and the men were quiet again in that same particular way. Pete ate 4 pieces. Cutter asked if there was butter, and there wasn't. But Mabel had made a spread of rendered fat and herbs that served the purpose. And when she put it on the table, he looked at it for a moment and then tried it, and didn't ask about butter again. What she had not counted on, or not fully, was Gideon Blackstone. She'd assumed he would be present in the background of the job, her employer, a complication to be managed, someone who would either approve or not approve as the weeks passed. She had not expected that he would be so difficult to read, or that his difficulty would matter to her. He was a man who had clearly decided at some point that efficiency was a reasonable substitute for human warmth. He ran the ranch with competence. He was not cruel to his men. She had seen enough unkind men to know the difference. But he maintained a distance that had the quality of something deliberately constructed, like a fence you put up not to keep animals in, but to keep certain weather out. He ate every meal she cooked. He was never late for breakfast. He occasionally stayed at the table after the other men had gone, looking over ledgers or maps, and she would work around him, clearing and cleaning, and sometimes in those quiet spaces he would ask something, not personal, not intimate, just practical. "What did you use for the sauce tonight?" "Cider. And rosemary from the kitchen garden, if it grows there. I found a few stems." "I didn't know there was a kitchen garden." "There wasn't much, but it's there." He'd look at her for a moment, then back at his ledger. He did this 4 times in the first 2 weeks. She counted. She wasn't sure why she counted. On a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week, she was finishing the dishes when she heard something in the sitting room. A sound she couldn't immediately identify, a kind of scraping or shifting. She went to look and found Gideon Blackstone on his hands and knees on the sitting room floor, trying to move a heavy oak sideboard that had apparently shifted and was no longer level. He heard her in the doorway and looked up, and she had the sense that he was not accustomed to being seen doing something he couldn't easily do. "It keeps rocking," he said. "Floor's uneven. He didn't finish the sentence. Mabel looked at the sideboard. She looked at the floor. She went to the kitchen and came back with 2 wooden shims she cut from a piece of scrap pine she'd found in the woodpile, and she handed them to him without ceremony. He looked at her. He looked at the shims. "Front left leg," she said. He fitted them. The sideboard settled. He rocked it once, twice, and it held. "Thank you," he said. He said it like someone who hadn't said the words in a while and wasn't quite sure of the pronunciation anymore. "It's nothing," she said, and went back to the kitchen. But she thought about it later, in the small room off the kitchen that she slept in. Thought about the expression on his face, which had been something she didn't have a clean word for. Not gratitude, exactly. Or not only that, something more like the expression a person gets when they're reminded unexpectedly that other people are real. She didn't know what to do with that. She put it aside and went to sleep. By the end of the 3rd week, the mood of the ranch had shifted in ways that were difficult to name, but entirely real. The mornings were calmer. The men came to the table less ragged. They were eating better, but not fancier, just better. And that kind of thing works on a person over time in ways they don't notice until they're already different. Cutter had started leaving the kitchen door open when he came to get morning coffee, which was his version of acknowledgement. Pete helped with the wood without being asked, every day now, and had begun to linger in the kitchen the way young people do when they've decided a place feels like something. Even Harlan had found a kind of grudging equilibrium. He still watched her with the particular wariness of a man whose initial predictions haven't been borne out and who hasn't forgiven her for it, but he'd stopped making comments about the work being too hard. And once, just once, when she'd come in from the woodpile in the cold with her coat dusted in snow, he'd poured her a cup of coffee and left it on the counter without a word and walked away. She didn't make anything of it. She just drank the coffee. The jokes about her size had not stopped entirely. She caught one on a Saturday afternoon, 2 hands near the barn, something quick and ugly, and then one of them glancing toward the kitchen window and seeing her, and the fast, uncomfortable silence that followed. She held the look for a moment, long enough for them both to feel it, then went back to what she was doing. Later that afternoon, Pete appeared in the kitchen door with the expression of a boy who had witnessed something and was trying to work out his position on it. "Those 2 guys earlier," he started. "Let it be," Mabel said. "But, Pete." She set down the knife she was working with and looked at him properly. "I've been dealing with that my whole life. You defending me in the yard doesn't make it stop. It just gives it more air." She picked the knife back up. "The food is what changes things, not arguments." He thought about that. "That doesn't seem fair." "No," she said. "It isn't." He stayed and helped her prep for supper without another word. She was grateful for it in a way she didn't express. Because some gratitude is too complicated to put into language, and it's kinder to everyone to just let it be. On the last Saturday of the month, Mabel woke before her usual time. She wasn't sure what had pulled her out of sleep, some sound outside, or just the particular quality of the cold, which had dropped sharply overnight. She lay in the narrow cot for a moment, looking at the ceiling, then got up and went to the kitchen window. The yard was blue-gray in the pre-dawn dark. Frost had come in the night and laid itself over everything, the fence rails and the trough and the bare ground, so that the whole place had a careful, preserved look, like something that had been set under glass. Gideon Blackstone was in the yard. He was standing near the corral fence, looking out at the hills, a cup of something warm in his hands. He was still in his shirt, no coat, which seemed like a bad idea. And he had that posture she'd started to recognize, the one where his shoulders were up slightly and his jaw was set, and he was looking at something in the middle distance that wasn't actually there. She watched him for a moment, not with any particular intention, just watching. Then she went and started the stove because the stove needed starting, and because there were things you could do something about and things you couldn't, and it was worth knowing the difference. By the time the kitchen was warm and the coffee was ready, he'd come inside. He stood at the kitchen doorway, coat on now, and looked at the stove with the expression of a man who has been cold and is choosing not to admit how glad he is to not be cold anymore. She poured him a cup and left it at the end of the counter. He came and got it. "Early for you," he said. "Couldn't sleep." A pause. The fire cracked. Outside, a horse shifted in the corral. 30 days is almost up," Gideon said. She kept her hands moving, beginning the bread dough she'd been planning. "I know. I'm not—" He stopped. Tried again. "The arrangement. I'd like to continue it, if you're willing." She looked up at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. "Same terms?" she asked. "Better terms," he said. "You've earned it." She turned back to the dough. Her hands worked it steadily, pressing and folding. "Then yes," she said. "I'm willing." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He went out to start the day's work. Mabel stood alone in the warm kitchen, her hands deep in flour, and let herself feel the quiet satisfaction of it. Not victory, nothing as sharp as that. Just the solid, unglamorous feeling of having kept her word, of having done what she came to do. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt off the fence rails. Somewhere in the barn, a horse was making noise about breakfast. She had work to do. She did it. The second month began the same way the first had ended, with Mabel's hands in dough before the sun came up, and the rest of the ranch still sleeping in that particular dense silence of men who have worked their bodies past comfortable. But something had shifted, and she felt it even if she couldn't have pointed to the exact moment it happened. It was in the way the kitchen door got left open now, the way men who'd once passed through without acknowledgement had started nodding when they came in for coffee. Small things. The kind that didn't mean much individually, but added up to something when you stopped and looked at the sum. She was not naive about it. Respect on a working ranch was not the same as warmth, and warmth was not the same as trust. She had earned a version of the first. The other two were different negotiations entirely. The week after Gideon had renewed her terms, she found a sack of dried cherries in the back of the cold storage that no one had apparently noticed. They were not in great shape, some dried too hard, some showing the beginning of something she didn't want to encourage. But she sorted through them for an hour at the end of the evening, salvaging what was usable, and on Sunday morning she made a cherry and brown sugar tart that came out imperfectly. The crust was thicker on one side than the other. The filling ran a little when she cut it. And she put it on the table anyway, because imperfect food that tasted like something was worth more than perfect food that tasted like nothing. Pete ate 2 pieces. Cutter ate 1, and then sat there looking at his plate for a moment with the expression of a man remembering something he hadn't thought about in a long time. "My mother made something like this," he said, not to anyone in particular. Mabel was at the sink. "What did she use?" "Dried plums, mostly, whatever she had." "Same principle." He scraped his plate. "Yeah," he said, "same principle. She didn't make anything sentimental of it. But she noted it. She noted all of it, the way you learn to notice things when you've spent a long time in rooms where you weren't expected to matter." The trouble started in the 5th week, on a Tuesday, and it started, as most trouble does, with someone who had decided his own discomfort was more important than anyone else's. His name was Roy Dunbar. He was one of 3 men who had come to the ranch the previous fall as seasonal help and had stayed into spring because Harlan had needed the extra hands through the difficult winter. He was 40-something, with a reddish complexion and the manner of a man who had spent years finding his own opinions very interesting. He'd been the loudest of the voices in the first week, the one she'd heard through the bunkhouse wall once or twice, the one whose laughter carried. He had quieted some since then, but it was the quieting of a man who had relocated his complaints rather than abandoned them. On Tuesday morning, she was carrying the midday meal out to the north field. Harlan had a team of 4 hands repairing fencing that had buckled under the winter ice, and she packed the food in a basket and carried it out on Biscuit, which she had been doing 3 times a week for a month without incident. She got down, tied the mare, began unpacking the food. Roy was there. He watched her unpack without helping, which was normal enough. But then he said, loud enough for the others to hear, "Wonder how long before she eats more than she serves." It landed in the air and stayed there. The other men went still in the particular way that people go still when something ugly has been said in public and no one is sure yet who is going to respond to it. Mabel kept unpacking the food. Her hands were steady. She set out the wrapped sandwiches, the jar of pickled vegetables, the small pot of beans she'd kept warm in a cloth. She worked without speaking, without looking up, until everything was out and arranged, and then she looked at Roy Dunbar directly. "Lunch is ready," she said. Nothing else. She began to walk back toward Biscuit. "That all you've got to say?" She stopped. She turned around slowly. "I've been cooking for this crew for 5 weeks," she said. "The food's been good. The men are eating well. The ranch runs better when people aren't half-starved and miserable." She paused. "You don't have to like me, Roy. You have to eat the food." She turned back to the horse. "So eat it." She rode back without looking back. Her jaw was tight the whole way. Her eyes were dry, which required some effort, but not as much as it once had. She'd had more practice than most people at swallowing this particular kind of thing. What she hadn't seen, didn't find out until Pete told her that evening, in the kitchen, with the hushed enthusiasm of someone reporting important intelligence, was that after she'd left, Cutter had picked up his sandwich and looked at Roy Dunbar and said very calmly, "That woman works harder than any 2 men on this property. You say something like that again, you're on your own for lunch." He hadn't said it loudly. He hadn't needed to. Pete relayed this with visible satisfaction. Mabel listened without showing much. "You're not going to say anything?" Pete asked. "What would I say?" "I don't know. Thank you. Something?" "I'm not going to thank a man for treating me like a person," she said, not unkindly. "That's not something I'm supposed to need to be grateful for." She handed him a bowl of soup. "Eat that before it gets cold." He ate it. He understood, or was starting to. She told Gideon about it. Not that evening. She let a few days pass, not out of reluctance, but because she wanted to present it factually rather than emotionally, and she needed a little distance from it to do that. She found him on Thursday after supper, in the sitting room with his ledgers, and she stood in the doorway and told him what Roy Dunbar had said, and what she had said, and what Cutter had said, all of it plainly, the way you report a problem with a piece of equipment. Gideon listened. His expression during this recounting was difficult to categorize. He was very still. "I'm telling you," she said, "because it affects the crew's working environment, not because I need you to do something about it. I can manage Roy Dunbar." "I'll handle it," Gideon said. "You don't have to." "I'll handle it," he said again, not loudly, but with a finality that closed the subject. She looked at him for a moment. "All right." She started to turn away. "Mabel." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it stopped her. "What he said," Gideon started, then paused, as if the sentence had taken a turn he hadn't expected. That's not what this ranch is." He looked like a man trying to say something he didn't have well-worn language for. "What you've done here in 5 weeks. It matters." She stood in the doorway and looked at him, this solitary man in his solitary room with his ledgers and his careful distance, and she felt something complicate in her chest. Not romantic, or not only, but something more fundamental than that. The feeling you get when someone who has been withholding something finally, unexpectedly, gives a little of it. "Thank you," she said. She meant it simply, without freight. He nodded and looked back at his ledger. She went to bed and lay in the dark for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just feeling the day settle around her like sediment. Roy Dunbar was gone by Saturday. She didn't see it happen. She didn't ask for details. She noticed his absence at breakfast, and Harlan said very neutrally that Roy had decided to take his leave, and that was the last that was said about it. Pete looked at Mabel across the table with an expression of nearly restrained triumph. She gave him a look that said, "Don't." He ate his eggs. Quotes. With Roy gone, a different kind of quiet took hold. Not uneasy, cleaner than that. The men who had watched him, who had maybe laughed at his jokes because it was easier than not laughing, seemed to exhale a little. There was more conversation at the table, not just the transactional talk of working men, but something more like actual exchange. Someone would say something and someone else would answer, and Mabel, moving around the kitchen and the table in her efficient orbit, would sometimes add to the conversation, and no one seemed to think this was unusual. She started paying attention to preferences. Cutter liked his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and would not eat eggs if they were overcooked, a preference he had never stated but that she'd noticed from the first week. The slight arrangement of leftover egg on his plate, never finished if it had gone rubbery. She adjusted. He didn't say anything, but he started finishing his eggs. A quiet man named Ellis, who worked the horses and spoke so rarely that she'd initially thought he was mute, turned out to have a significant weakness for anything sweet made with cinnamon. She discovered this by accident when she made a cinnamon raisin porridge on a cold morning, and Ellis, who normally ate mechanically and left, ate 2 full bowls and then sat looking at his empty bowl for a long moment before getting up. "I could make that more often," she said. He looked at her. "If it's no trouble." "It isn't." He nodded once and went out. The next morning she made it again, and he ate 2 bowls again, and they never directly discussed it, and somehow this felt like one of the more satisfying conversations she'd had on the ranch. Harlan remained the most complicated. He was not warm. She wasn't sure warmth was available to him, or if it had been and he'd spent it somewhere a long time ago and hadn't found a way to replenish it. But he had stopped testing her. He'd stopped making comments designed to establish her limitations. He had arrived at some internal determination about her competence and had filed it and moved on. And this was, in its way, its own form of respect. Once on a morning when the wind was bad and she was struggling to get the outside pump to work before breakfast, it had a tendency to freeze in the mornings and required coaxing. Harlan appeared beside her without announcement and worked the pump handle in the particular rhythmic way that apparently unlocked it, and the water came through. "You have to do it slow first," he said, "then faster." "I'll remember that," she said. He went inside. She filled her pot and followed. That was Harlan Cole, in its entirety, and she accepted it. Well, it was Gideon who confounded her, not in dramatic ways, in the small ones that accumulate without announcing their intention. He had taken to arriving in the kitchen sometimes in the late evening, after supper, when she was doing the final cleanup of the day. He always had a reason, a question about the provisions inventory, or a practical matter about the coming week's meals. But the reasons grew increasingly thin as the weeks passed, and she was observant enough to notice that the length of the stays had nothing to do with the stated purposes. He would lean against the counter and ask his question, and she would answer, and then he would stay, and they would talk. Not about anything remarkable, about the ranch mostly, about provisions and weather and the practical concerns of the property. But the conversations had begun to acquire a texture that practical conversations don't usually have. He asked things that were adjacent to what he actually wanted to know. She answered and left space, and sometimes he stepped into it. "Were you always cooking?" he asked once, on a Thursday that had been cold all day and was now very quiet. "My mother started teaching me when I was 6, she said. I took to it. She says I understood flavor before I understood arithmetic." "Do you like it?" She considered. "I like feeding people. That's not the same as liking cooking exactly, but they're connected. I like when something I make changes the shape of someone's day." She wiped down the counter. "Does that sound strange?" "No," he said, after a moment. "It sounds like what you're good at." She looked at him. He was looking at the window, which showed nothing but dark in his own reflection. "What about you?" she said. "The ranch. Did you choose it?" Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. "My father built it. I grew up here." A pause. "After he died, someone had to run it." "That's not what I asked," He turned to look at her. It seemed like it surprised him, the directness of that, though she hadn't meant it to be pointed. "No," he said, after a moment. "I suppose it isn't." He picked up his coffee cup and held it, not drinking. "I don't know what I would have chosen. I've never thought about it that way." "Maybe you should." The words came out before she'd quite decided to say them. She almost walked them back, then didn't. "Maybe I should," he said slowly, as if testing the idea. He left shortly after, but the next evening he came back, and he stayed a little longer. She didn't let herself think too much about it. She had made that mistake before, reading warmth into attention and ending up feeling foolish in the aftermath. She was not a woman who had ever been pursued or flattered or given reason to believe that a man's continued presence near her had anything to do with her specifically rather than the proximity of food and warmth. She knew what she looked like. She had been made aware of it with sufficient regularity that she had no illusions about it. But she was also, at her core, an honest person, and honesty required her to notice what she noticed. Gideon Blackstone looked at her when she was talking. Not through her, not past her, but at her. With the kind of attention that meant he was actually registering what she said, actually sitting with it. He remembered things she mentioned. He had remembered, 3 weeks later, that she'd said her mother grew chamomile in her kitchen garden, and on a morning when a supply wagon came in from town, he'd produced, from among the dry goods, a small cloth packet of dried chamomile that he'd apparently thought to include in the order. He set it on the kitchen counter without comment. She looked at it. She looked at him. "It's for tea," he said. "I know what chamomile is." "Right." He turned to go. "Gideon." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. This was thoughtful. He stood there for a moment with his back half to her, and she could not see his face, but she saw the slight change in his shoulders, a loosening, just fractional. "It's nothing," he said, and left. She made the tea that evening. She drank it alone in the kitchen after everything was clean, the stove banked for the night, the house settling into its usual quiet. It was good tea. It tasted like something someone had been paying attention. The hardest thing about Gideon Blackstone was not that he was cold. It was that he was cold and sad, and the sadness was the thing you couldn't ignore once you'd seen it. It sat just under the surface, in the way he moved through the house, in the way he looked at the photographs on the sitting room mantel when he thought no one was watching, in the way he sometimes stood in the yard in the evening for no functional reason, just standing, looking at the land. She pieced together what she could from what the men said, which was not much because they were loyal in the inarticulate way working men often are. His wife had died. She'd heard Pete say this once, quietly, and then immediately seemed to regret having said it. 4 years ago, or maybe 5. An illness, something fast. He had been different before. That part Pete did not say in words exactly, but it was in the space around what he did say. She didn't ask Gideon about it. It was not hers to ask. But she thought about it when she was doing the quiet work of the kitchen, the kneading and stirring and the small adjustments that cooking required. Thought about what it meant to run a place this size and this demanding while also carrying that particular weight. She thought about the way grief could calcify into something that looked like hardness if you left it long enough. She'd watched her mother do a version of that after Mabel's father had gone. Watched her retreat into the pure functionality of work, until work was the only vocabulary she had left. She understood it. She didn't think it was all right, but she understood it. By the end of the 6th week, she had the kitchen running the way she wanted it. The inventory was organized and current. She'd established a rotation of meals that gave the men variety without requiring provisions they didn't have. She'd gotten the garden, what there was of it, cleared of winter debris and planted the cold hardy things, radishes, some spinach, green onions. The first shoots were already up, pale and determined in the uncertain spring soil. She'd also, quietly and without announcing it, done a number of other things around the property that were not, strictly speaking, her responsibility. She'd noticed the bunkhouse window that didn't close properly and told Pete to mention it to Harlan, who had it repaired. She'd found a water stain on the kitchen ceiling that turned out to be from a gap in the roof above, and she'd told Gideon about it at supper one evening with enough specifics, where the stain was, its size, what happened to it when it rained, that he'd gone up and looked the next morning and had a man on the roof before noon, She had not stopped to consider whether any of this was her job. The boundaries of her job had always seemed to her less important than the work that needed doing. Gideon had looked at her when the roof repair was finished with an expression that fell somewhere between puzzled and grateful. You could have just said it was raining on the stove. It wasn't raining on the stove, it was raining next to the stove. There's a difference. She'd paused. You would have noticed eventually, anyway. Maybe. You're busy. I'm not going to leave a problem sitting because pointing it out might seem like overstepping. He was quiet for a moment. Is that something you've had to think about a lot? Whether things are overstepping? It was the most personal question he'd asked her directly, and it sat in the air between them with a weight that surprised them both. Most of my life, she said honestly. He didn't respond to that, but he held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment she thought she could see him trying to say something he didn't know how to say yet. Then Harlan appeared in the doorway, asking about the north pasture gate. And the moment closed, and Gideon was the ranch owner again, and she was the cook, and that was fine. That was what it was. She went back to the kitchen. She started supper. The spinach was almost ready to harvest, she thought. Another week, maybe. The green onions were faster. She'd make something with those this week, something simple that tasted like the beginning of a season. The men would probably not notice what made the meal different, but they would notice that it tasted like something arriving rather than something held over. That was enough for her. That was, she had learned, almost always the part nobody saw. The attention behind the thing, the thought before the act. The work that made the work possible. She did not do it for recognition, which was useful because recognition was not reliably available. She did it because she was there, and because she was good at it, and because in some way she had never fully articulated even to herself. Making something that sustained people was the closest she had found to a language that said what she actually wanted to say. She stood at the stove and stirred, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the spring wind was moving across the ridge. And somewhere down the hall, Gideon Blackstone was going over his books. And somewhere in the yard, Pete was probably talking too much at whoever would listen. And the ranch turned on its axis the way it always did, indifferent and demanding, and, she was beginning to think, worth something. In the particular way that difficult things you've chosen are always worth more than the easier ones you didn't. The green onions came up on a Thursday, which Mabel took as a small, uncomplicated piece of good news in a week that had been otherwise unremarkable. She harvested them in the early morning before the kitchen work started, crouching in the garden plot with a basket and her coat still on, the soil cool and dark under her fingers. And she thought about nothing in particular, which was a thing she had gotten better at since coming to Blackstone Ranch. The ability to simply be in the middle of a task without the noise of other things crowding in. She had not always had that. She made a soup that night with the onions and the last of the winter potatoes and some smoked meat she'd been rationing carefully, and it was the kind of soup that tasted like an argument against winter, something warm and specific and unambiguous. Ellis had a second bowl, Pete had a third, and then looked slightly ashamed of himself. Cutter told her, with no particular ceremony, that it was the best thing she'd cooked since the bread. She thanked him and went back to the stove and did not let herself feel too much about it, because there was still the morning's dishes to finish and the larder to check and a dozen other small things that didn't stop needing to happen just because the soup had been well received. Gideon came in late, as he sometimes did when the ranch work ran long. She kept a covered plate for him on the back of the stove. He sat down and ate without talking, and she worked around him. There was a companionable quality to the silence that she had stopped questioning. It was simply a thing that had developed between them, like a path worn into the grass by repeated passage. Not planned, just the result of consistent motion in the same direction. When he was done, he pushed the plate aside and sat there with his coffee, and she was washing the last pot. And then he said, "I rode the south boundary today. The fence there needs significant work." "How significant?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. "That'll be hard work in this weather. The men should be eating more." He looked at her. "Is that a request?" "It's an observation. You're already paying me. I'm not asking for more." He looked at his cup. "I'll adjust the supply order. The dried beans have been running low, and we need more flour than usual." "I'll handle it." She nodded and went back to the pot. The kitchen was quiet for a while, just the fire and the wind outside. "How is your mother?" he asked. She paused, just for a moment, then kept washing. "About the same. I got a letter last week. She says the cough is better in the warm weather. She set the pot on the rack. She's stubborn. That helps. Stubbornness, Gideon said, with something in his voice that was almost, not quite, a dry amusement, seems to be a family trait. She turned to look at him. He was looking at his cup, but there was something around the edges of his expression that she hadn't seen before. Not quite a smile, but the region where a smile might live if it were allowed. I'll take that as a compliment, she said. You should, he said. He picked up his cup and his hat and went to bed. Mabel stood in the cleaned kitchen and looked at the door he'd gone through, and then she looked at the fire and the stove grate, and then she went to bed herself and lay there for a while doing a thing she told herself she wasn't doing, which was thinking about the way his voice sounded when something almost made him smile. The letter arrived on a Monday in the 7th week, and it arrived like most bad things do. Not announced, not preceded by any particular warning, just there, in the bundle of correspondence that the supply wagon brought up from Cutter's Fork. Mabel recognized her Aunt Claire's handwriting on the envelope before she recognized what that meant, and then she understood it in the same instant, because Clara would not write to her at the ranch unless Ruth had asked her to, and Ruth would not ask Clara to write unless she couldn't write herself. She read it in the kitchen, standing up, because she'd picked it up on her way from the yard and hadn't yet thought to sit down. The kitchen was empty. The men were all out working, the midday meal done and cleared. She read it once, quickly, and then stood there for a moment, and then read it again more slowly, as if the second reading might change what it said. It didn't. Her mother's lungs had worsened significantly in the last 2 weeks. The doctor in Millhaven, which was where Ruth had family, where she'd gone when she could no longer work, had said the illness was advanced. He had said she needed consistent care and rest, and the kind of attention that Clara, who had her own household and 4 children, could not fully provide. He had said Ruth needed Mabel. The letter was careful. Clara was a practical woman, and she wrote in practical sentences and did not try to soften the news beyond what was necessary. But there was one line near the end where the practicality slipped. She asks about you every day. She worries more about you than about herself, which is very Ruth. Mabel put the letter on the counter. She put her hands flat on the counter next to it. She looked at the wall. The wall did not have anything useful to offer, but she looked at it for a while anyway. She told Harlan first. This was the practical decision. Harlan managed the operations, and the operations needed to keep running regardless of what happened next. She found him in the barn and told him, plainly, that she had received word about her mother and would need to leave. She watched his face go through several things in quick succession. Surprise, then the particular calculation of a man who manages logistics and has just had a key element removed from his plans. Then something more complicated that she thought might be concern, though it was hard to be certain with Harlan. How soon? He asked. As soon as I can arrange the travel. 2 days, I think, if I can get a message to my aunt that I'm coming. There's a supply wagon heading to Cutter's Fork Wednesday morning. That'll work. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands in the unconscious way he did when he was thinking about something he didn't want to say out loud. Then he said, I'm sorry about your mother, Miss Hart. She's a good woman. Coming from Harlan, this was an extended speech. She understood it for what it was. Thank you, Harlan, she said. She went back to the kitchen and began making an inventory of everything she could prepare in advance. What could be made and stored, what instructions she could leave, what the men could manage on their own for a week or two before Gideon needed to find another arrangement. She worked steadily through the afternoon, making notes, starting a batch of preserved beans, a salt-cured pork that would keep. She worked the way she always worked, which was with her full attention, because giving less than that felt like abandoning something that didn't deserve to be abandoned. She did not let herself think too hard about the other conversation, the one that still needed to happen. She found Gideon in his office that evening, after supper, when the house was settling into its nighttime quiet. She knocked on the door frame and he looked up from his ledger. Can I come in? He gestured toward the chair across from him, which she'd never sat in before. She sat. She told him about the letter. She told him about her mother. She told him she needed to leave Wednesday, and she told him what she'd already prepared and what instructions she'd written out, and she told him that she was sorry to leave things in an incomplete state, because there were 2 projects she'd been midway through. The kitchen garden, which would need tending, and a plan to reorganize the cold storage that she hadn't quite finished implementing. Gideon listened. He didn't speak while she talked. His expression was the controlled one, the one that didn't give much away, but his hands had stopped moving. He'd put his pen down at the beginning and hadn't picked it back up. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to have a shape. "The arrangement," he said, finally. "It doesn't have to end. It may need to for a while. My mother needs care. I don't know for how long. A leave of absence." "Gideon," she said it the way you say something when you want someone to stop offering the version of things that makes it easier. "I don't know what's ahead. I can't make that kind of promise to you. It wouldn't be honest." He looked at her. Something in him had tightened. She could see it in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders. "What do you need for the journey?" The shift, from the harder subject back to the practical one, was abrupt enough that she nearly said something about it. But she looked at his face and understood that the shift was not avoidance. It was the way he managed things that were too big for the space he had available. "The wagon on Wednesday is sufficient. I can pay my own. I'll cover the travel costs. Don't argue with me about it." He picked up his pen, put it back down, looked at his ledger without seeing it. "Is there anything else you need?" It was not quite a question. She recognized the tone, the one where he was doing several things simultaneously, and the visible one was not the most important. "No," she said. "Thank you, Gideon." She stood. She was almost to the door when he spoke again. "Mabel." She turned. He was looking at her, and his expression had come open in a way she had not seen before. Not fully, not without some remaining restraint, but more than she'd been given access to before. There was something in it that she recognized without wanting to name it too quickly, because the last time she'd named something like this, she'd been wrong and the wrongness had cost her something she hadn't recovered quickly. "I hope she gets well," he said. "I mean that." "I know you do," she said. She went to her room. She sat on her cot. She looked at her hands, flour-stained, work-roughened, entirely familiar, and she breathed steadily until the tightness in her throat passed. She did not cry. She'd learned a long time ago that crying used up resources she usually needed for something else. But she sat there for a good while, feeling the weight of what she was leaving and what she was going toward, and she let herself feel it because there was no point pretending it wasn't there. The next 2 days were loud with work. She cooked with a kind of focused intensity that even Pete noticed, coming into the kitchen on Tuesday morning to find her halfway through what appeared to be a full week's worth of preparation. "You're making enough food to last through summer," he said. "I'm making enough to get them through 2 weeks without someone who knows what they're doing," she said. "There's a difference. Harlan can cook. Harlan can boil water and slice bread. That's not cooking, that's just applying heat to food and hoping." Pete was quiet for a moment. Then, in a smaller voice than usual, "How long are you going to be gone?" She looked at him. He was trying to look like someone who was asking an administrative question and failing at it. "I don't know," she said. "Will you come back?" She kept her hands moving. "I don't know that either, Pete. I want to, but I can't promise something I'm not certain of." He nodded and looked at the counter and then, without being asked, started helping her without another word. He was not skilled in the kitchen. He was slow and uncertain and twice asked her where things were that he'd walked past 20 times. But he was present, which was the thing she needed most. Cutter came in the afternoon and did not say anything about her leaving, but he helped her carry preserved jars to the cold storage with a care and deliberateness that communicated, in his wordless way, that the work mattered, and he knew it. Ellis appeared briefly, asked nothing, dropped off a bundle of dried herbs he'd apparently found somewhere, and left. She looked at the herbs for a moment. She did not know when Ellis had found those or why he'd thought to bring them, and she did not ask. She finished packing her room the night before she left. It didn't take long. She'd arrived with a canvas pack and she was leaving with the same one, with the addition of several small things she'd accumulated in 2 months. A river stone Pete had given her for no particular reason that she'd been using as a paperweight. The tin of herbs she'd brought from her mother and mostly used down. The cloth packet of chamomile that Gideon had ordered for her, which she'd kept back enough of to bring home. She left the cooking reference book on the kitchen shelf. She'd had it so long she knew most of it from memory anyway, and the kitchen needed something more than her written notes. She left a clean apron hanging on the hook by the door. She left the garden instructions written out in her clearest hand, with sketches of what each plant looked like at this stage, so nobody pulled the vegetables out thinking they were weeds. She was up at 4 in the morning out of habit, and she made coffee and sat in the kitchen in the dark. Just sat, which was not something she usually allowed herself. And she looked at the room that she had spent 2 months making functional and warm, the organized shelves and the clean stove and the window through which she'd watched the frost melt and the first green things come up in the yard. And she let herself feel what she felt about leaving it. She felt quite a lot, as it turned out, more than she'd expected, which was useful to know. The wagon left at first light. She was ready. Most of the men were in the yard when she came out with her pack, which she had not expected and which required her to take a short, quiet breath before she crossed the porch. Pete was there, of course, looking like he'd been up for hours worrying about being up early enough. Cutter stood back, hands in his pockets, and gave her a nod that contained most of a paragraph. Ellis was there, which surprised her. Ellis, who communicated in gestures and silences, was standing near the wagon and had apparently helped hitch the horses, and when she came close he said simply, "Safe travels, Miss Hart," and she said, "Thank you, Ellis." And that was that. Harlan shook her hand. His grip was firm and brief and entirely without sentiment, which was the most Harlan thing he could possibly have done, and she was grateful for it. She was settling her pack into the wagon when she heard the door of the main house. Gideon walked across the yard without hurry, with the same measured stride he always used, and the men had the good sense to find things to look at in other directions. He came to the side of the wagon and looked up at her where she sat on the bench. He had something in his hands. She looked at it before she looked at his face. It was her mother's recipe book. She had left it in the kitchen deliberately. It was Ruth's, technically, the original one Ruth had built over 15 years of cooking, which she'd lent to Mabel when Mabel had come to the ranch. She'd left it because she hadn't been sure she had the right to take it. It lived here, with the meals it had made. "You forgot this," Gideon said. "I didn't forget it." He held it up, and she looked at it, and then she looked at his face. His expression was careful, but not as controlled as usual. There was something in it that was working hard. "Take it," he said. "It belongs to your family." She reached down and took the book. Their hands were close for a moment, shy, not touching, but close enough that she was aware of the proximity in a way she didn't try to explain. "Gideon," she said. "Don't." He said it quietly. "Don't say you're sorry. You haven't done anything wrong." "I wasn't going to apologize," she said. "I was going to say, thank you for the 30 days you gave me and the 60 after that. You didn't have to believe I could do this. You didn't at first, but you gave me the chance anyway, and I want you to know that mattered to me." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set. His eyes were doing something she could not fully interpret. "Your mother's lucky," he said finally. "She'd argue that," Mabel said. "She argues with everything." Something broke through then. Not a smile exactly, but the real version of that thing she'd been catching glimpses of, that warmth he kept so carefully banked. It lasted only a second before he brought it back, but she saw it. "Go," he said, "before it gets any later." She looked at him one more time, memorizing, though she wouldn't have admitted that to herself. And then she turned to the front and picked up the reins, and the wagon began to move. She did not look back. She looked straight ahead at the road through Wyoming, and she held the recipe book in her lap with both hands, and she breathed the cold spring air that smelled of pine and thawed earth. And she told herself with reasonable success that she was composed and practical, and that whatever she was feeling was manageable. She told herself this for about half a mile. Then she allowed herself, in the privacy of the empty road, to feel it completely. The leaving, the loss of the place, the uncertainty of what came next, and the particular ache of whatever had been building between her and the man standing back in the yard, who she was not letting herself think about too specifically. She let herself feel it for the length of one long breath. Then she put it somewhere she could carry it without it showing, and she turned her attention to the road, and she drove. She did not know what was happening back at Blackstone Ranch in the hours after the wagon disappeared around the long curve in the road. She would not know it for weeks. What she would eventually piece together, partly from Pete's letters, which arrived with the earnest regularity of someone who has decided correspondence is his natural medium, and partly from other sources she couldn't have anticipated, was that the ranch changed in her absence in the way that places change when the thing that made them warmer has been removed. The men ate, Harlan managed. The work went on, because the work always went on. But something had gone out of it, some quality that nobody named directly because naming it would have required admitting they'd grown dependent on it. The meals were functional, the kitchen was clean enough. The days passed, and Gideon Blackstone, who had spent years building a life defined by what he would not need from anyone, sat in his office on a Tuesday night in the third week of Mabel's absence and looked at the space on the kitchen shelf where the recipe book had been, and then looked at the door that led to the small room off the kitchen, which was empty now and had the wrong kind of quiet. He sat there for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the dark, and he began slowly to think about what a man does when he's spent long enough convincing himself he doesn't want something, and then finds out, too late and in the wrong order, that he was wrong. He did not arrive at an answer that night, but he did not stop thinking about it either, and that in itself was something new. The fact that the question would not lie down, that it kept returning in the spaces between other thoughts, insistent and inconvenient and entirely real. Outside, the spring wind moved across the ridge. The horses shifted in the corral. The ranch sat in its nighttime stillness, and somewhere in that stillness, in the not-quite-finished kitchen garden with its pale shoots reaching up through the dark soil, the green things Mabel had planted kept growing. That part, at least, did not stop. The town of Millhaven was not large enough to have a hotel worth the name, but it had a boarding house on the main street run by a widow named Mrs. Pratt, who charged fair rates and asked no unnecessary questions, which suited Gideon well enough. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Mabel had left Blackstone Ranch, having ridden hard for 2 days on a route that was not particularly forgiving in late spring, when the creek crossings ran high and the roads between here and there were either mud or the kind of dried ruts that jarred a horse's legs at the wrong angles. He had told Harlan he was going to look at some cattle. Harlan had said nothing, which was its own form of response. Gideon had left before the question became anything he'd have to answer directly. The decision itself, the actual moment he'd moved from thinking to doing, had come not with fanfare, but with the quiet simplicity of someone who had finally stopped arguing with himself. He'd woken on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after Mabel's departure, made his own coffee because no one else had made it, and because Harlan's version was undrinkable, sat down in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of herbs and wood smoke, and something he could not name but recognized, and understood, not as a revelation, but as a plain and unglamorous fact, that he was going to go find her, that not going would be a choice too, and a worse one. He was not a man who did things like this. He was aware of that. He had spent 4 years becoming a man who did not do things like this, who had constructed his life around the specific project of not needing anything that could be taken from him again. It had been working, more or less. He had the ranch. He had the work. He had the adequate numbness of a life kept deliberately small. And then Mabel Hart had shown up in his yard on an old mare in the snow and cooked his men the best meal they'd had in 2 years, and something had started moving in him that he had not been able to stop, and he had tried, and the trying had not worked. And here he was in Millhaven, mud-spattered, his horse at the livery, standing outside a boarding house at 3 in the afternoon, having ridden 2 days for a woman who had given him no particular reason to believe she would be glad to see him. He went in and paid for a room, and asked, as casually as he could manage, whether Mrs. Pratt knew of a woman named Ruth Hart, who'd been unwell, or her daughter Mabel, who'd recently come to town. Mrs. Pratt looked at him with the particular acuity of a woman who had operated a boarding house for 15 years and had heard every variety of story a person could construct. "Ruth Hart is doing better than she was," she said. "Her daughter's been here about 3 weeks. Set up a little bakery out of Clara Finch's old storefront on River Street." She tilted her head. "You a relation?" "No," Gideon said. She kept looking at him. She said, with a volume of meaning compressed into one syllable. He thanked her and went up to his room. He didn't go to River Street that evening. He told himself this was because he needed to eat something and rest and think about what he was actually going to say, which was true. He had ridden 2 days with a great deal of certainty about the going and almost no preparation for the arriving, and now that he was here in the specific town where Mabel specifically was, the situation presented itself in a more complicated light. He sat in Mrs. Pratt's dining room and ate a bowl of something that was not as good as anything Mabel had made in the first week at the ranch. And he drank coffee that was adequate. And he thought about what he knew. He knew she'd left the ranch because her mother needed her. He knew she'd done it without complaint and without drama, and with more consideration for the people she was leaving behind than most people would have managed. He knew she had not made him any promises, and had not asked him to wait, and had not, as far as he could tell, given him any unambiguous sign that what he was feeling was felt in any version on her side. He also knew that she had looked at him, at the wagon, in a way that he'd been thinking about for 3 weeks, and was fairly sure was not something he'd invented. He wasn't sure any of this added up to a justification for showing up in Millhaven. But he was here, and the cattle story had already been told, and he was not going to go back without at least having the conversation. He went to bed. He slept badly, which was normal for him in places that weren't his own. River Street was short, 4 storefronts and a feed supplier, and a building that appeared to be in the process of becoming something, but hadn't decided what yet. Clara Finch's old storefront, which Gideon found without difficulty because Millhaven was not a complicated town, had a new sign in the window that said simply, "Hearts," in hand-painted letters that were not perfectly even. The paint was still fresh-looking. Through the window he could see a counter, a few small tables, and shelves where things were arranged with the orderly purposefulness that he recognized. He stood on the sidewalk in front of it for a moment. A woman walking past with a basket looked at him, and then looked at the bakery, and then looked back at him with an expression that suggested she was updating some internal story she'd been following. He didn't acknowledge this, and she moved on. He opened the door. The smell hit him first, bread and something sweet, and the particular quality of a kitchen that has been running for hours. It was 8 in the morning. The space was small and warm and brighter than the exterior had suggested. There were 2 men at one of the small tables eating what appeared to be rolls and talking in low voices. There was a woman he didn't know behind the counter, middle-aged, wiping down the surface with a cloth. And then Mabel came through the door from the back kitchen, carrying a tray with both hands, wearing a flour-dusted apron and a look of concentration, and she saw him. The tray didn't fall. That was the first thing. She was too steady for that. But she stopped moving completely, for the span of 2 full seconds, and the look on her face in those 2 seconds was something he filed away with the careful attention of a man who has been watching someone's face for months and knows all the registers of it. Then she set the tray down on the counter and said to the woman beside her, "Clara, can you get these on the shelf?" and came around the counter toward him. He didn't know what he'd expected. Something restrained, maybe. Something that gave him very little to work with, which was how he'd have handled it. Instead, she stopped about 3 feet from him and looked at him with a directness that he had come to understand was simply who she was, and she said, "Gideon, what are you doing here?" "I came to see you," he said, which was both the true answer and, he realized as he said it, the only one he had. She looked at him for a moment. "You rode 2 days." "Yes." "That's a hard ride this time of year." "Yes." She studied him, not unkindly, but not giving him anything easy either. Behind her, one of the men at the table said something to the other, and they both left, which was either coincidence or consideration. Clara had disappeared into the back. "My mother's here," Mabel said. "She's sleeping. She sleeps late still, but she's better. The doctor says the worst of it has passed." She said this like she was giving him context, like she'd decided to let the information sit between them before anything else did. "I'm glad," he said. "I meant it when I said that. I'm glad she's better." Mabel nodded. She was quiet for a moment, and he waited. "You should sit down," she said. "I'll get you coffee." "Mabel," Gideon. She said it the same way he'd said it to her once, the same quiet finality. "Sit down. I just pulled cinnamon rolls out of the oven, and they're better when they're warm, and whatever you came to say will say better over food. That's just true." He sat down. Note. She brought coffee, real coffee, better than Mrs. Pratt's, and 2 cinnamon rolls on a plain plate, and she sat across from him and wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at him with an expression of careful patience that told him she was not going to make this easier for him by filling the silence. He tried the roll. It was good. The icing was not too sweet. The dough had the right amount of give. "Pete's been writing you letters," he said, because it was a way to start. A small smile crossed her face. Once a week. He told me about the fence repair and about Ellis adopting that stray cat. I don't know how it got in the barn. Ellis fed it, that's how. Of course. He turned his cup. The garden. Your spinach came up. Harlan pulled it. He didn't know what it was at first. She closed her eyes briefly. I wrote instructions. He found the instructions after. Of course he did. She opened her eyes. The smile had faded into something more serious. How is the ranch? Running, he said. It runs. The food is not... He stopped. I'm not asking about the food. No, he said. I know you're not. He looked at his cup. It's quiet. It's... He tried to find the right word and couldn't, and after a moment he let that go and looked up at her. I don't sleep well. Her expression shifted, something behind it opening a fraction. Neither do I, she said. He set his cup down. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table, the posture of a man who has ridden 2 days and is done with the preamble. I'm not good at this, he said. Saying things. I know that. I know there's a version of this conversation where I should have found better words before I came, and I don't have them, and I'm just going to tell you what I know, and you can do whatever you want with it. She waited. I know the ranch is better with you in it, he said. I know I am better, or I was. These last 3 weeks I've been thinking about not just the kitchen or the men, though that's part of it. I've been thinking about you talking in the kitchen at night, and the way you handled Roy Dunbar, and the shims for the sideboard, and the chamomile. He paused. I think about the chamomile more than is reasonable. Her hands had tightened on her cup. I spent a long time building a life that didn't need anything from anyone, he said. After my wife died. I just decided that was the safer thing. And it worked, in the sense that nothing hurt, but nothing felt like anything either. I didn't realize how far gone it was until you came and cooked that first meal, and I sat there and ate it, and actually felt something, just from being in a warm kitchen. That shouldn't have been the thing that did it, but it was. He stopped talking. He'd said more in the last 2 minutes than he typically said in a week, and he was not certain it had come out in the right order. Mabel was quiet. She was looking at him with an expression he could not fully read, which was unusual. He'd learned most of her expressions over 2 months. I need to ask you something, she said. All right. The woman who came to your ranch in March, the one your men laughed at in the yard before she'd even gotten off her horse. She kept her voice even. You saw that. You did some version of that yourself, in your office. I could see it on your face. You looked at me and made an assumption. She was not angry about it exactly, but she was not letting it go either. I'm not saying that to accuse you of something. I'm saying it because I've spent my whole life being the person people don't choose. Or if they do, it's in spite of something, like they're being magnanimous. And I can't... She stopped, took a breath. I can't do that. I can't be someone's exception. I need to know if you see me. Not the version of me that proved people wrong, just me. It was the most she had ever said about this, he realized, about the thing she'd been carrying the whole time. He didn't answer right away. He sat with it, which she would understand because she was a person who respected the space before an answer. The first day, he said finally, I thought you wouldn't last. That's true. Not because of... I told myself it was practical, but it wasn't entirely. And I was wrong. He held her gaze. But here's what's also true. I started watching you, not in spite of anything, because you kept doing things that required attention. The drainage fix in the cold storage, the roof, the way you talked to Pete like he was a person worth talking to, not just a boy, the way you stood in the yard after Roy said what he said, and you didn't fall apart, and you didn't let him see what it cost you. He paused. I see all of that, and none of it is in spite of you, Mabel. That's just you. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. You rode 2 days, she said again, but this time it meant something different. I wasn't going to say nothing, he said. That seemed worse. Something moved through her expression, not the brightness of easy happiness, but something slower and more durable than that, the kind of thing that has been arrived at rather than bestowed. My mother is here, she said. She needs care for at least another month, maybe 2. The bakery, she gestured toward the room around her. This happened because I needed something to do, and Clara had the space, and it turns out there was nothing like it in this town. People have been coming every morning. She looked at the counter, the shelves. I didn't plan it, but it's not nothing. No, he said, it's not nothing. I'm not walking away from her. I'm not asking you to. And I'm not... She stopped, started again. I'm not walking away from this either. I built it. I'm not good at leaving things I've built. I know that about you, he said. She turned her cup in her hands. So what are you asking, exactly? He thought about how to say it. I'm asking if I can come back after things are... when your mother is stable. I'm asking if there's something to come back for. He paused. And I'm asking if I can come to this bakery tomorrow morning. Because the coffee is better than anything in Cutter's Fork and the rolls are... He looked at the half-eaten roll on the plate. I need to think about the rolls. She looked at the roll. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted into an expression she didn't usually let show. Not quite a smile, the precursor to one, the moment before a person lets themselves believe something. The rolls are better in the afternoon, she said. I make them fresh. I'll come in the afternoon then. And the morning. And the morning, he agreed. Ruth Hart was smaller than Gideon had imagined from Mabel's descriptions. Small and bird-like and sharp-eyed, in the particular way of women who have been diminished by illness but have not been softened by it. She was sitting up in a chair in the back of Clara's house when Mabel brought him in that evening, and she looked at him with an attention so complete and unapologetic that it was like being evaluated by someone who had been doing it professionally for decades. This is Gideon Blackstone, Mabel said. He runs the ranch where I was working. I know who he is, Ruth said. Mabel wrote me letters too. She looked at Gideon with those sharp eyes. Sit down. You're making me tired just standing there. He sat. You rode 2 days, Ruth said. Yes, ma'am. In late spring, through the creek roads. Yes. Ruth looked at Mabel. Mabel looked at the wall in a way that suggested she was exercising significant self-control. Can I get you something? Mabel said to the room generally. Tea. I have chamomile. I'll have tea, Gideon said. Of course you will, Ruth said with a tone he couldn't quite parse. Then, when Mabel had gone to the kitchen, she doesn't talk about herself to people. You understand that. I'm beginning to. She's done that her whole life, taking care of things. Made herself useful so nobody could say she wasn't worth keeping around. Ruth's voice was not unkind, but it was direct in the way of people who have been ill long enough that they have stopped seeing the point in preamble. She thinks if she just works hard enough, people will eventually stop seeing what she looks like and see her instead. They should, he said. They should, Ruth agreed, but should and do are different things, and she's had enough experience with the difference to have built some walls around herself about it. She looked at him steadily. I'm telling you this because you rode 2 days, and that means something, but it doesn't mean I'm not watching. I wouldn't expect otherwise, he said. Ruth seemed to find this acceptable. She settled back in her chair. She makes good bread. I taught her that. Everything else she figured out herself. The soup she made with the green onions, he said. The first ones from the garden. Ruth looked at him. Something in her expression shifted very slightly, a small recalibration. She told you about the garden? She planted it, at the ranch. I watched her do it. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She planted one here too, she said, more to herself than to him. First week she arrived. 3 feet of soil behind the house, and she's already got things coming up. She shook her head. She can't help herself. Mabel came back with the tea and distributed it without ceremony, and sat down in the third chair, and the 3 of them sat in the small, warm room, and for a while nobody said anything particularly important, and it was, unexpectedly, one of the more comfortable evenings Gideon had spent in several years. He stayed 4 days. He had not planned 4 days. He had planned, loosely, to say what he came to say, and then go back and run the ranch, which needed running. But the first morning he went to the bakery at 8 and drank 2 cups of coffee and watched Mabel work. And the afternoon he came back, as she'd suggested, and the rolls were in fact better, and she sat with him for 30 minutes between customers, and they talked. About the ranch, about the bakery, about Ruth's recovery, about the doctor's instructions. And it was easy in a way that conversations were not usually easy for him. The second day he came again. The third day she walked him around the town. Not a romantic walk, nothing planned. She was picking up supplies and needed an extra pair of hands. And they stopped at the feed store, and the dry goods supplier, and the small post office. And the people they encountered looked at Gideon with undisguised interest and looked at Mabel and then back at Gideon. And Mabel introduced him straightforwardly as the owner of the ranch where she'd been working. And nobody pushed further than that, but the interest remained. An older woman named Mrs. Garfield stopped Mabel outside the post office and said, loudly enough for Gideon to hear from 3 feet away, "Your roles have been making my husband get up 20 minutes early every morning just to get there before they sell out. I want you to know that is unprecedented." Mabel said, "Tell him Tuesdays I make extra." Mrs. Garfield looked at Gideon. "And you are?" "Gideon Blackstone," he said. "From the Blackstone Ranch?" "Yes." "That's a long way." "Yes," he said. Mrs. Garfield looked between them with the focused interest of someone who does not intend to let an incomplete story remain that way. "Well," she said eventually, "we're glad to have visitors." She said visitors with a particular emphasis that communicated she did not for a moment believe that was the whole of it. When she'd gone, Gideon said, "She's going to tell everyone." "She's going to tell everyone," Mabel agreed without visible distress. "That's what Mrs. Garfield does. By tomorrow the story will have us engaged." She said this matter-of-factly, as if she were describing weather. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything about that for a long moment. "I should deal with that supply order," she said. "Right," he said. They went into the dry goods store. He left on the 4th day, in the morning, before the bakery opened. Mabel walked out with him to where his horse was tied, and they stood in the quiet of the early street, the town not fully awake yet, the light thin and clean. "I'll write," he said. "Pete writes enough for the whole ranch," she said. "I'll write separately." A pause. "If that's—" "Yes," she said, simply, without making him ask the full question. "Yes, right." He took the reins. He didn't get up immediately. "The bakery," he said. "It's good. You built something real here." "I know," she said. "I'm not—" He stopped and started again. "I'm not asking you to give it up. I want to say that clearly. Whatever happens, this is yours." She looked at him steadily. "What do you think is going to happen?" He thought about that. "I don't know the shape of it yet, but I know I'm not done." He looked at her. "Are you?" She held his gaze. The morning air moved between them, cool and unhurried. "No," she said. "I'm not done." He got up on the horse. She stood back and watched him settle, and he looked down at her from that height. And she looked up at him, and they were both people who had been hurt in different ways by different things, and had learned from it different versions of the same caution, and they both knew this. And there was something in that shared knowledge that made the air between them feel honest in a way that was neither easy nor uncomfortable, but simply real. "Take care of your mother," he said. "Take care of my garden," she said. He almost smiled. It was a close thing. "I'll try." He rode. She stood on the street and watched until he was around the corner and out of sight, and then she turned and went back inside and began the morning work that was already waiting, because the bread did not know or care about the state of her heart and needed to be tended regardless. She started the ovens. She began to feel, carefully and without letting it become too large too quickly, a thing she had not felt in a long time. Not happiness, not exactly, because happiness was too simple a word for what was assembled here, too light for the weight of it. Something more complicated, something that included her mother sleeping in the next house, and the green things coming up in the yard, and the letters that would come from Pete and, separately, from Gideon. Something that included this room she'd made from nothing in 3 weeks, the imperfect sign in the window, the customers who came back every morning, the rolls that were better in the afternoon, something that felt, tentatively and without guarantees, like the beginning of a life she had actually chosen. She put the first loaves in and closed the oven door and turned to the next thing, and the town of Millhaven began to wake up outside the windows, and the morning went on. The letters came on Wednesdays mostly. Pete's arrived first, always longer than necessary, filled with the particular density of someone who had discovered written language as a new outlet for his considerable conversational energy. He wrote about the horses and the fence repair and Ellis's cat, which had produced a litter of 4 in the hayloft, and which Ellis had named collectively the committee. He wrote about Harlan finally admitting that Mabel's organized inventory system was better than the previous arrangement, which Pete described as a historic moment equivalent to a mountain moving. He wrote about the weather and the south pasture and the way the kitchen garden had come up in full by July, with the spinach and radishes and the green onions that had gone to seed and then come back again in the second planting, because Mabel had left instructions for that too. Gideon's letters came separately as promised. They were shorter than Pete's and said more. He wrote about the ranch in the practical terms that were natural to him, but around the edges of the practical things there were other things. Observations about the land in early summer, the way the light hit the ridge in the evenings, a sentence about a foal born in June that he described in 3 lines with more visible feeling than he probably intended. He asked about the bakery with specific questions, not general ones. Not how is it going, but did the Tuesday rolls sell out again? You mentioned Mrs. Garfield's husband, and she understood that this was how he showed attention, and she had learned to read it for what it was rather than what it wasn't. She wrote back. She told him about her mother's improving color, about the new recipe she'd been developing with dried apricots, about the way the town had begun to organize itself around Hart's Bakery in small ways. The men who came before the feed store opened, the women who stopped in mid-morning, the children who appeared whenever she made anything with cinnamon, drawn by the smell the way Ellis's cat was drawn by warmth. She did not write about what she felt exactly, because she was not yet sure she had the right language for it. But she wrote with the fullness of someone who had someone worth writing to, and she thought he understood that. Ruth was on her feet by July. Not fully, not the way she'd been before, and the doctor was clear about what the limitations were now, what Ruth's lungs would and would not tolerate going forward. No more long rides, no more heavy kitchen work in cold weather. A life calibrated to what her body could sustain rather than what her stubbornness suggested. Ruth received this information with the expression of a woman receiving a verdict she intended to appeal. And then, over the course of several weeks, she made the adjustments. Quietly, without making a production of it, she shifted. She came to the bakery in the mornings, not to work but to sit, and she drank her tea and watched Mabel and occasionally offered an opinion on something. The apricot recipe needed less sugar. The bread was rising too fast in the summer heat and needed a cooler spot, and Mabel mostly listened and occasionally disagreed, and they worked out the shape of this new arrangement between them without discussing it directly. "You're staying," Ruth said one morning in August, not looking up from her tea. It wasn't quite a question. "For now," Mabel said. "The ranch owner has been writing letters." "I know. I write back." Ruth looked up. She had the same direct quality of attention that Mabel had. Genetic, apparently, something passed down alongside the recipe for bread. "What does he want?" "I think he's still working that out," Mabel said. "So am I." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "You're not afraid of working something out," she said. "You never have been. Don't start being afraid of it now." Mabel kept her hands moving. "I'm not afraid of the working. I'm just not going to rush it." "Reasonable," Ruth said. She picked up her tea. "He rode 2 days." "I know. In late spring, through the creek roads." "I know, Mama." Ruth set her cup down with a small sound of finality. "All right," she said. "All right." Gideon came back in September. She had not known he was coming. The letter saying so arrived 2 days after he did, which was a result of him moving faster than the mail, which was, she thought, its own kind of statement. He appeared at the bakery on a Tuesday afternoon, looking less road-worn than the first time, but still carrying that quality he had of a man who has been moving with purpose and has arrived at his destination and is now in the slightly uncertain position of the arrived. The bakery was not empty. There were 3 women at the corner table and a man at the counter waiting for his order, and Clara was helping him, and Mabel was in the back when she heard the bell over the door and came out and stopped. He looked different in September light than he had in May. Or she was different. Her eye for him had grown more specific over the months, the letters and the distance doing something to her perception that she hadn't anticipated. She saw him more clearly than she had before, or perhaps just without some layer of wariness that had been in the way. He looked at her. "Your letter arrived after you did," she said. "I know. I apologize." "It's fine," She came to the counter. "Are you staying at Mrs. Pratt's?" "Yes." "How long?" A pause. "That depends on some things." Clara, to her credit, found an immediate reason to be in the back. Mabel untied her apron. "I'll be back in an hour," she said to the empty air where Clara had been, reasonably confident Clara could hear her. They walked. There was a stretch of road at the edge of Millhaven where the town gave way to open country. Not dramatic country, not the ridges and draws of Blackstone's land, but decent land, flat and golden in September, with the dry grass moving in a wind that had started to carry the first edge of autumn. They walked there without discussing where they were going, and when they'd gotten far enough that the town was just a cluster of rooftops behind them, they stopped. "Tell me," she said. He turned his hat in his hands, which she'd learned was how he thought. "I've been talking to a man in Cutter's Fork. A builder. I've been thinking about expanding the ranch house. There's a room off the east side that's been used for storage for years. It could be a proper kitchen. Better than what's there now." He paused. "A kitchen that would suit someone who knows what they're doing." She looked at him. "Gideon, I'm also thinking about the outbuildings. There's a structure near the road that hasn't been used since the fire in '74. With some work, it could be a storefront, or the bones of one." She was very still. "I'm not asking you to give up what you've built," he said quickly, as if he'd been rehearsing this part. "I know what the bakery means. I know you made it from nothing in 3 weeks, and people come to it every morning, and it matters. I'm not asking you to choose between that and—" He stopped, tried again. "What I'm asking is whether there's a version of things where you don't have to choose, where Millhaven gets your bakery and Blackstone gets—" He stopped again. "Gets what?" she said. He looked at her directly. "Gets you. If you want that, all of it, the whole complicated arrangement of it, your mother and the bakery and the garden and whatever comes next." His jaw was doing its set thing, but his eyes weren't. His eyes were just open. "I'm not good at this. I've told you that. I don't have the right words for most of it, and I probably never will. But I know what the ranch was before you came, and I know what it was after, and I know what it's been since you left. And those are 3 very different things, and I don't want the last version anymore." The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere behind them, Millhaven went about its afternoon. Mabel looked at this man, this difficult, careful, lonely man who had ridden 2 days twice now and was standing in a field in September turning his hat in his hands. And she felt the full weight of what was being asked and offered simultaneously, and she let herself feel it without immediately doing anything about it. She had spent a long time being the person who was not chosen, not dramatically, not with scenes or declarations, just the slow accumulation of being overlooked, passed over, categorized before anyone had bothered to look. She had made peace with that, or the version of peace that was really just deciding to need less. She had built her life around things she could control, the work, the food, the care of other people, because those things did not require anyone to choose her first. And now someone was choosing her first, not in spite of anything, not as a compromise or a settling or a magnanimous gesture toward someone who'd proven herself useful enough to deserve it. He was choosing her the way you choose something you understand the value of, with specificity, with information, with the full knowledge of what the choice entailed. She understood that this was not a small thing. She also understood that it was terrifying, which was useful information, because she had learned that the terrifying things were usually the ones worth doing. "The outbuilding near the road," she said. "Yes." "What condition is it in?" Something in his expression shifted, a cautious aliveness, like a banked fire when someone opens the damper. "It needs work. The roof is sound. The walls need attention. How much land is there around it?" "Enough." She looked at him. "I need to talk to my mother." "Of course. And I need to think about the practicalities. The bakery here, there are people who depend on it now. Mrs. Garfield's husband gets up 20 minutes early." "I know." He almost smiled. It was very close. "I'm not saying no," she said. "I know that too," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the open land around them, the Wyoming sky enormous overhead, the grass going gold in the afternoon light, and she thought about Blackstone Ranch, the kitchen she'd organized, the garden she'd planted, the table of men who'd gone from laughing at her to passing her the butter without being asked. She thought about Pete's letters and Ellis's cat and Harlan's version of warmth, which was just slightly less cold than his version of cold. She thought about a man coming into a kitchen at night to ask questions he didn't need the answers to. "I need until October," she said. "October," he agreed. "I'll come back myself. You don't have to ride here again." "I was going to come anyway." "Gideon, the rolls are better in the afternoon," he said steadily. "You told me that yourself." She looked at him. And then, for the first time in this whole long year, Mabel Hart laughed. Not a polite laugh, not the managed version she used when something was merely pleasant, but the real one. The one that came from somewhere unguarded. And it surprised her when it came out, and she could see that it surprised him too, and that he looked at her the way a person looks at something they've been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. "October," she said again, when she could. "October," he said. Back. She came back on the 12th of October, which was a Friday, on a hired wagon with 3 trunks and her mother in the seat beside her, and a cutting from the Millhaven Bakery's starter dough wrapped in cloth in a tin box on her lap. The bakery in Millhaven she had not closed. She had found, in the last 2 weeks of September, a woman named Dorothea Beale who had been cooking for her family of 8 for 20 years and who had the particular combination of skill and steadiness that the work required. Mabel had spent 10 days teaching her the rolls, the bread, the apricot recipe, the cinnamon porridge, and had sat with her through 3 full mornings of service. And on the last morning she had watched Dorothea manage the counter and the oven and the customers with the competent ease of someone who had been doing this kind of work her whole life, just under a different name. And she had understood that the bakery would not collapse without her. It would change, but it would continue, which was the important part. Mrs. Garfield had cried, which Mabel had not anticipated, and which required her to spend several minutes in the back organizing things that didn't need organizing until she was composed enough to come back out. "You'll come visit," Mrs. Garfield had said. "I'll send the recipe for the rolls," Mabel had said. "That's not the same thing." "No," Mabel had agreed. "It isn't." She'd sent the recipe anyway, before she left. Blackstone Ranch in October was different from Blackstone Ranch in March. The light was lower and the color of good whiskey on the hills, and the air had that particular autumn quality of something being carefully put away for winter. The trees along the creek had gone yellow and rust and a particular orange that had no adequate name. The yard looked tidier than she'd left it, she noticed, with a complicated feeling she didn't unpack immediately. Pete was in the yard before the wagon had fully stopped, which meant he had been watching for them, which meant Gideon had told him they were coming. He helped with the trunks with the eager energy of a large, enthusiastic dog, and managed not to say anything embarrassing for nearly 4 minutes before he told Mabel that Ellis's cat had named herself, which was a story that required explanation and took a while. Ruth climbed down from the wagon with more steadiness than she'd had in March, and looked at the property with the eyes of a woman who had worked here for 11 years and was assessing what 11 years looked like from the outside. "It's held up," she said. "It has," Mabel agreed. Harlan appeared from the direction of the barn and came across the yard and shook Mabel's hand and then, with a slightly awkward formality, shook Ruth's as well. "Mrs. Hart, good to see you on your feet." "Good to be on them," Ruth said. Harlan turned to Mabel. "Kitchen's ready. I restocked it last week per the list you sent." She looked at him. "You followed my list." "It was a good list," he said, in a tone that discouraged further comment on the subject. Gideon came out of the main house as she was carrying the tin with the starter dough, and he crossed the yard without hurry, and when he reached her, he looked at the tin and then at her. "You brought the sourdough starter," he said. "It takes months to develop. You don't throw it away and start over." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "You don't." Ruth, standing 3 feet away, made a small sound that could have been a cough and could have been something else. The first morning back, she was up at 4:30 without the alarm of any kind, purely from the body's old knowledge of what this kitchen required. The stove came to life the way she remembered, with the particular draft that meant you needed to leave the lower vent slightly more open than seemed right. The coffee was on by 5. The kitchen was warm by 5:30. Boom. She stood in the middle of it and looked around at the organized shelves and the clean counter and the empty space that had been waiting, and she felt the particular feeling of returning to a place that has been yours in practice, if not in name. The satisfaction of competence in a familiar environment, yes, but also something more than that. The feeling of a place that has been holding a space for you. Cutter appeared at 5:40, earlier than usual. He poured himself coffee and stood with his back against the counter and looked at her and said, "Morning." "Morning," she said. "Good to have the kitchen right again," he said. It was for Cutter a speech. She treated it accordingly. "Good to be back," she said. Ellis appeared shortly after, and he looked at her with his usual economy of expression, and then he looked at his coffee, and then he said, "The starter is on the shelf, second from the left, in case you need it." She looked at the shelf. There it was, her sourdough starter, which she'd sent ahead by Pete's hands 2 weeks ago with specific instructions for its feeding, which she had written out in detail because she did not trust the collective cooking ability of 20 ranch hands with a living culture. "You kept it alive," she said. "Pete kept it alive," Ellis said. "I told him when to feed it." "Thank you, Ellis." He said, and took his coffee out to the barn. The outbuilding near the road took 4 months to become what she had in mind for it. She was involved in the planning from the beginning, not as a passive recipient of someone else's decisions, but as a full participant, sitting with the builder Gideon had found in Cutter's Fork and arguing productively about the placement of windows and the width of the counter and the question of whether there was enough space for a second oven, which she maintained there was and the builder maintained there wasn't, and Gideon mostly listened to both positions with the expression of a man staying out of something he is wise enough to stay out of. There was a second oven. She had been right about the space. Harlan, who had initially regarded the outbuilding project with the skepticism he brought to all developments that disrupted the ranch's operational patterns, became, over the course of the winter, its most consistent advocate. He organized the work crew when the ranch hands were available. He kept the building schedule against his ledger. When the roof needed an additional beam that the original plan hadn't accounted for, he sourced it before anyone else had noticed the problem. Mabel noticed one evening in December that Harlan had begun stopping by the kitchen in the mornings, not for operational reasons, but just stopping by. Standing in the doorway with coffee, looking at whatever she was doing, occasionally making a comment that was not exactly conversation but was adjacent to it. She understood that this was Harlan arriving, in his own time and in his own way, at something he'd been working toward since October. One morning she made enough cinnamon porridge for 1 extra bowl and left it at his usual spot without comment. He ate it. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. But the hardest thing about the winter was not the cold or the work or the business of building. It was the in-between. The period where she and Gideon were still navigating the shape of what they were to each other, still finding the edges of it, and the finding was not always graceful. He was a man who defaulted to silence under pressure, and she was a woman who had learned to wait out silences but not indefinitely. And there were evenings when those two tendencies met in the kitchen and produced a friction that neither of them quite knew how to resolve. The worst of it came in January, over something that was not really about what it was about. She had been talking to the builder about expanding the bakery's storefront, a modest expansion, just enough for a few more tables. And she had made the decision and moved forward with it before discussing it with Gideon, because in Millhaven she had been making her own decisions and had not recalibrated to a different arrangement and had not, if she was honest, fully thought about what their arrangement actually was. Gideon found out from the builder and came to the kitchen that evening with a quietness that she recognized immediately as the wrong kind. "The builder said you approved the expansion," he said. "I did. It's on my land." She looked up from what she was doing. "It is," she said carefully. "You're right." A silence. "I should have talked to you first," she said. "Yes. I'm used to making decisions alone." "I know. That doesn't make it right." He looked at her. Some of the wrong kind of quiet went out of him. "No," he said. "It doesn't." A pause. "I'm also—" He stopped. "I should have been clear earlier about what this arrangement is. Legally, practically. I've been avoiding that conversation because I didn't know how to have it without it sounding like I was issuing conditions." She set down the knife she'd been holding. "Say it plainly." He looked at her steadily. "I want this to be yours," he said. Not just the bakery, the kitchen, the garden, the whole of the property as much as mine. But I don't know what you want, and I've been waiting for you to tell me, and you're not—" He stopped again. "I'm not good at asking for things," she said. "No. Neither are you." "No." They looked at each other across the kitchen. There was something almost absurd about it. Two people who had been circling each other for the better part of a year and still couldn't quite land. "What do you want?" she asked him directly. "Say it plainly. I can hear it." He was quiet for a long moment, and she waited, and she let the silence be what it was. "I want to marry you," he said. "I've wanted that since approximately October, and I haven't said it because I thought it was too fast, and then I thought it was too slow, and then I ran out of reasons, and here we are." She looked at him. He looked back. "That's plain," she said. "Yes." "I want time to think." He blinked. "Right. Not much time, a few days." "A few days," he said. "And we need to talk about the property arrangement before any of the rest of it," she said. "I'm not signing my life into something I don't understand the terms of. That's not stubbornness, that's just sense." "I know, I agree. I should have started there." "Yes, you should have." She picked up the knife again. "Sit down. Supper's almost ready, and this is not a conversation to have on an empty stomach." He sat down. She made supper, and they ate, and they talked about the property and the practical questions of it, about what her name on things would mean, and what her voice and decisions would mean, and he was straightforward about all of it in a way that told her he'd been thinking about it for a while and had been trying to find the right entry point. And she listened and asked questions and pushed back on two things, which he accepted, and they reached, over the course of that meal, a set of understandings that were not yet formal, but were real. She gave him her answer on a Thursday morning, in the kitchen, before anyone else was up. She said yes. She said it without preamble, while she was making coffee, and he was in the doorway, because the moment presented itself, and she saw no reason to dress it up further. He came into the kitchen and stood close to her and put his hand against her face, carefully, the way a person handles something they have decided is worth being careful about. And she looked up at him, and there was nothing clean or simple about either of them, nothing uncomplicated or perfectly resolved, but there was this. Two people who had come through enough difficulty to know the difference between settling and choosing, and who had, with full information and reasonable fear and the imperfect courage available to ordinary people, chosen. She leaned into his hand. The coffee finished. Outside, the January dark was beginning to loosen at the edges. Spring came again, the way it always does on the Wyoming frontier, not all at once, but in pieces, a warm day followed by two cold ones, the snow retreating and returning, the ground making up its mind slowly. The bakery opened on a Tuesday in April, not the ranch bakery exclusively. It had been serving the ranch through the winter, but its public face, the outbuilding on the road with the sign that Pete had painted, with significantly more enthusiasm than skill, which meant the letters were the correct size, but not entirely level, and Mabel had looked at it for a long moment and decided it was better that way. A perfect sign would have been wrong for this place. People came from Cutter's Fork, which was 6 miles up the road. A family came from even further, having heard about it through the network of frontier communication that moved faster than anyone could fully account for. Mrs. Garfield wrote a letter, not to Mabel, but to her cousin in Cutter's Fork, which found its way to enough people that Mabel suspected it had been intended as advertisement, describing the roles with a specificity that functioned as recommendation. By the third week, the morning regulars had established themselves. The two brothers who ran the timber operation east of town, the school teacher from Cutter's Fork who rode out Mondays and Thursdays, the older couple from the next valley who had been married 40 years and disagreed about everything except the bread. Ruth Hart sat at the corner table most mornings and drank her tea and received this parade of people with the ease of someone who has been watching the world long enough to find it mostly interesting. She talked to the schoolteacher about things Mabel couldn't fully hear from the kitchen. She advised the older couple on the subject of their recurring disagreement with the diplomatic firmness of someone who has had 11 years of experience managing 20 working men. She was happy. It took Mabel some time to recognize it because she'd never seen her mother quite like this before. Not the working happiness of a woman with things to accomplish, but the settled happiness of a woman who has arrived somewhere and knows it. Gideon learned to be present in a way he hadn't been before. It was not a transformation. She would have trusted a transformation less than she trusted this, which was gradual and uneven and sometimes required backtracking. There were still evenings when he went quiet in the wrong way, and she had to decide whether to wait it out or push at it. And sometimes she chose wrong, and sometimes he came back faster than she expected. He was a man who had been alone a long time, and being alone a long time does things to the circuitry that don't reverse quickly. But he came to the bakery. He sat at the corner table when the morning rush was done and drank his coffee and watched her work. And sometimes he talked to the customers in his careful way, and sometimes he carried things that needed carrying without being asked. And once, this was the thing she thought about later, when she was considering what a year had made of them, he stood at the kitchen doorway at the end of a long Tuesday and looked at her cleaning up after a full day and said quietly, "You should be tired." "I am," she said. "Sit down. I'll finish that." She looked at him. "I know how to wash a pot," he said, with a defensive dignity that made her want to smile. She sat down. He washed the pots. He was not fast, and his technique was adequate rather than skilled, but he did it completely, and when he was done, he wiped down the counter. Not in her systematic way, but thoroughly enough. And he sat across from her in the clean kitchen, and they drank the last of the coffee and didn't say anything in particular. This was, she understood, the thing that people didn't tell you about. The version of love that wasn't a rival or declaration, but just the daily choosing of it, the washing of pots and the sitting in the quiet and the continued decision, made without ceremony, to be in the same room. There is something particular about a person who spends their life being told they are too much of one thing and not enough of another. Too large, too plain, too direct, too quiet, too much work for too little return. What that kind of telling does, over time, is create in a person a very detailed map of what they are not. Mabel Hart had carried that map for 23 years, had navigated by it, had organized her life around its contours. What she had discovered over the course of this year was that the map had been wrong, not in every detail. Some of the terrain it described was real. She was difficult in specific ways. She was stubborn past the point of usefulness sometimes. She made decisions alone when she should have made them together. She had trouble, still, asking for things she needed, and she suspected she always would. But the map had also told her she was not worth choosing, and that part had been a lie. And lies that are held long enough start to feel like terrain. The work of the year had been, in part, the work of revising the map, of discovering that worth was not a fixed thing allotted at birth in some quantity you either had or didn't, but a thing demonstrated through action, accumulated in the doing of work that mattered and the treatment of people with attention, and that a person who did those things had worth regardless of whether anyone had gotten around to telling them so. She had not needed Gideon Blackstone to tell her that, but she was glad, in the specific and uncomplicated way of someone who has stopped performing gratitude and started feeling it, that he had. On a Thursday in May, exactly 1 year after the spring morning, she had ridden out to Blackstone Ranch alone on an old mare with a canvas pack and a jar of blackberry preserves. Mabel stood in the doorway of the bakery in the early light and looked at the yard, her yard now. Her name on the property record, alongside his, which had required an afternoon in Cutter's Fork with a lawyer and a longer conversation before that about what her name being on things meant and what it didn't, and which had ended with Gideon signing the document with the expression of someone completing a task that should have been done sooner and who was not going to waste time being sentimental about it. The morning was cold still, but the cold had that quality that meant it would be warm by noon. The kitchen garden, expanded from the previous year because she'd had all winter to plan it, and a husband who had long since learned that arguing with her about the garden was a use of energy that returned nothing, was already showing the pale green of the earliest shoots. Pete was crossing the yard toward the bakery with the particular purposeful stride he'd developed over the year, which she thought was his version of looking like someone with things to do. He was better at the ranch work than he'd been, steadier, more confident. And he'd started teaching himself to cook in the bunkhouse kitchen on his days off, which was producing results that ranged from interesting to alarming. Ellis and Harlan were coming up from the barn. Ruth was visible through the bakery window at the corner table with her tea, saying something to the school teacher who'd arrived early. Gideon came out of the main house and crossed to her and stood beside her in the doorway and looked at what she was looking at. "Full morning," he said. "Always is Tuesdays." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to go start the ovens?" "In a minute." He looked at her. She was looking at the yard, at all of it, the accumulated ordinariness of a life that had been built rather than given, piece by piece, with work and stubbornness and the willingness to stay when staying was hard. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered the question. What was she thinking? She was thinking about a girl on a cold road with a canvas pack and a jar of blackberry preserves and the absolute terror of arriving somewhere new and unknown and possibly hostile, and the way that terror had been in the end less powerful than the need to try. She was thinking about 30 days and what 30 days can become if you're paying attention. She was thinking about the difference between a life that doesn't hurt and a life that matters, and how she had confused them for a while and then stopped. "I'm thinking about the preserves," she said. He looked at her. "I brought a jar of blackberry preserves when I came," she said. "The first day. I didn't need them. I brought them because—" She paused. "I don't know exactly. Something about having something good in the pack. Something that wasn't strictly necessary." He was quiet. "I used the last of them in February," she said, "in a tart I made for Ruth's birthday." "I remember," he said. "It was good. I need to put up more this summer, when the berries come in. There's a good stretch along the South Creek," he said. "More than last year, I think." "Then we'll go in July." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that expression she had finally, after a year, stopped being afraid of. The one that was just him, without the distance or the management. Just a man looking at a woman he had chosen and who had chosen him back, in full knowledge of what each of them was. "We'll go in July," he agreed. She turned back to the yard. The light was coming up over the ridge. The morning was starting. Somewhere in the kitchen the starter dough was ready, the ovens needed lighting, the bread needed making. She went inside. She started the fire. And the day went on the way days do when they are built on things that are real, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but forward, and with warmth, and with the particular satisfaction of a person who has finally stopped surviving long enough to understand what it means to live.